"The farm goes to your brother because farming is men work," my grandfather said flatly, sliding the draft of his will across the mahogany desk. I did not argue. I just nodded and walked away. Years later, his lawyer read the updated will aloud in front of the entire family. My brother dropped his pen when he heard my name instead. Before I share exactly how I legally dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud and sent my greedy relatives packing, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve. My name is Evelyn, and I am 34 years old. I work as a senior corporate restructuring consultant. I make my living finding the rot hidden deep inside failing companies and tearing them down to the studs. The air inside my grandfather's oak-paneled study tasted like stale cigar smoke and old leather. Outside the window, 2,000 acres of prime Iowa farmland stretched toward the horizon. It was a legacy worth tens of millions. Harlan, my 80-year-old grandfather, sat behind his desk. He tossed a thick stack of legal papers onto the blotter, looking at me with cold, dismissive eyes. "You get the cash trust, Evelyn," he stated, tapping a gnarled finger on the document. "The land goes to Chase. It has always been that way in this family. Farming requires a strong back. You just push papers around a desk." My brother Chase stood near the stone fireplace. I was 36, wearing a brand new pair of designer boots that had never touched actual dirt. He swirled a glass of bourbon with a patronizing smirk, lifting the corner of his mouth. "Do not take it personally," Evie Chase drawled, taking a slow sip. "We both know you would not know what to do with a tractor anyway. Stick to your spreadsheets in the city. The trust fund will keep you comfortable enough to buy all the designer suits you want." I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear over the blatant sexism that had dictated my entire childhood. In my line of work, emotional outbursts are vulnerabilities. I calmly picked up my leather portfolio, slid my chair back, and stood up. I offered them both a polite, tight-lipped smile. "I wish you the best of luck with the harvest." "Chase," I said smoothly. I turned and walked out of the study, my heels clicking a steady rhythm down the hallway. They thought I was retreating in defeat. They did not realize that during the 10 minutes I sat in that study, my trained eyes had been scanning the upside-down documents resting near Chase's elbow. I recognized the specific legal formatting of the paperwork. It was not an agricultural operating agreement. It was a commercial land division proposal. I drove back to my childhood bedroom and opened my laptop. I connected to the main house network. Chase had set up the new router last month using his own birth year as the administrator password. A rookie mistake. I slipped into the shared family drive. It took me less than 12 minutes to find the hidden folders. Chase had zero intention of running the family farm. He was already in advanced negotiations with an industrial chemical conglomerate. The moment our grandfather died, Chase planned to parcel out the 2,000 acres and sell it to developers who intended to build a toxic waste processing facility right over the local water table. He was going to poison the land our family had held for a century, pocket a huge payout, and leave town. I stared at the glowing screen as my pulse steadied into a lethal, calculated rhythm. Chase thought he had secured his golden ticket, but he had just handed a restructuring expert the exact blueprint of his own destruction. 6 months later, the estate had been transformed into a grotesque theater of rural philanthropy. Chase was hosting a heavily catered gala on the front lawn, complete with imported string quartets and towering ice sculptures melting slowly in the evening heat. Banners draped across the wraparound porch proudly advertised his newly registered corporate entity, a brand he audaciously named Heritage Sustainable Organics. It was a brilliant, albeit entirely fraudulent maneuver designed specifically to siphon federal grant money. The United States Department of Agriculture offered lucrative financial incentives for generational farms transitioning to green technology. Chase had filed the paperwork claiming he was overhauling the irrigation systems and eliminating synthetic pesticides. In reality, he was merely pocketing the federal subsidies to fund his lavish lifestyle while the crops remained untouched. I navigated the crowded lawn holding a simple glass of club soda. I watched my brother charm local politicians and agricultural board members. He wore a tailored linen suit, projecting the image of a progressive agrarian visionary. His wife Chloe glided through the sea of guests like a woman walking a runway. She was 26 years old and treated the family farm like her personal country club. Tonight she wore a silk designer gown that dragged across the manicured grass. Her neck glittered under the string lights. The diamonds she wore were flawless. My forensic background immediately calculated their retail value. I knew exactly where the capital for that jewelry originated. Chase had been quietly taking out high-interest agricultural loans against the property equity, using his unearned status as the heir apparent to push the paperwork through friendly local banks. Chloe spotted me standing near the buffet tables. She detached herself from a group of state representatives and marched in my direction. Her eyes scanned my tailored gray blazer and practical heels with naked disdain. She stopped just inches away, ensuring the politicians nearby could hear her clear, piercing voice. "Evelyn, you actually came?" Chloe cooed, her tone dripping with manufactured pity. "I am so glad you could take a night off from your little cubicle. But you really should have told me you were struggling. I would have gladly lent you one of my old dresses. Wearing a stiff office suit to a luxury gala just makes you look incredibly bitter and out of place." The state representatives paused their conversations, turning their heads to watch the exchange. They expected me to flush with embarrassment or snap back defensively. They expected a dramatic reality television moment. I offered her a serene, unbothered smile. I raised my glass of club soda in a polite salute. "You look stunning, Chloe," I replied, my voice radiating effortless warmth. "I truly want to congratulate both of you on this spectacular launch. Securing federal funding requires a very specific kind of talent. I am sure the government auditors will be fascinated by your sustainable organic methods. I hope you enjoy the evening." Chloe frowned. The sophisticated insult flew right over her head, but the lack of a defensive reaction unsettled her. She scoffed, adjusted her diamond necklace, and turned back to the politicians to resume her performance. I turned on my heel and walked away from the glaring light, slipping through the French doors into the darkened study and stepping out onto the secluded side balcony. The cool night air offered a sharp relief from the suffocating hypocrisy on the lawn. I was not alone in the shadows. Standing near the stone balustrade, swirling a glass of neat whiskey, was Marcus. Marcus is a razor-sharp environmental attorney operating out of the regional office for the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. He is also my sister, Clara's husband. An African-American man with an impeccable legal pedigree, Marcus possesses a mind that processes federal statutes like a supercomputer. I despise the superficial arrogance of my family just as much as I did, but he attended these events to keep the peace for Clara. Tonight, however, his presence was strictly business. Marcus did not offer a polite greeting. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek silver flash drive, pressing it flat into the palm of my hand. "You were right to ask me to look into the soil testing records," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble that barely carried over the distant music. "Chase is playing a game that is going to get people locked in a federal penitentiary." I slipped the flash drive into my blazer pocket. "What did you find?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the tree line. "The USDA grant fraud is just the surface layer," Marcus explained, stepping closer. "Your brother needed immediate liquid cash to keep his Wall Street creditors satisfied while he negotiates the land sale. Sustainable farming grants take months to clear the bureaucratic red tape, so he found a much faster, highly illegal revenue stream. He has been leasing the fallow acreage on the northern edge of the property to 3 different industrial manufacturing plants operating in the next county over." My jaw tightened. Leasing fallow land to industrial plants meant only one thing in the agricultural sector. "They are using the farm as a dumping ground," I stated, the horrifying reality clicking into place. Marcus nodded grimly. "Exactly. Those factories are generating heavy chemical byproducts. Disposing of industrial waste through legal federal channels costs millions in compliance and processing fees. Chase offered them a backdoor solution. He is allowing them to drive tanker trucks onto the legacy property under the cover of darkness. They are discharging thousands of gallons of toxic chemical waste directly into the soil. In exchange, the factory executives are paying Chase steep monthly bribes funneled through offshore shell companies. The sheer scale of the betrayal struck me like a physical blow. Chase was not just plotting to sell the farm after our grandfather passed. He was actively poisoning the earth that had sustained our family for 4 generations, just to finance his wife diamond collection and his own exorbitant debts. He was destroying the local water table, risking the health of the entire surrounding community. If the local municipal water authority detects those specific chemical markers, they are obligated to report the contamination to my agency. Marcus continued his tone, carrying the gravity of a federal prosecutor. The EPA does not issue warnings for intentional industrial dumping, Evelyn. We issue criminal indictments. If my office opens an official investigation and traces the toxic runoff back to this property, the federal government will initiate immediate civil asset forfeiture. I stared out over the vast expanse of the farm. Civil asset forfeiture meant the government would seize the entire 2,000 acres, regardless of who inherited the deed. The legacy would be wiped out overnight. The state would take the land, freeze all familial accounts to cover the environmental cleanup costs, and auction off whatever remained. Chase was driving the entire family toward financial annihilation. You have to stop him before the contamination reaches the aquifer, Marcus warned. If those chemicals hit the public water supply, the criminal charges elevate to a level that no defense attorney can negotiate down. The entire property will become a federal crime scene. I have delayed the routine soil inspections for this sector by burying the requests under administrative reviews, but I can only buy you a few more weeks before my superiors mandate a site visit. You need to secure the deed and lock him out before the EPA arrives. I gripped the stone railing of the balcony. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. I could not wait for Chase to orchestrate his land sale. I could not wait for my grandfather to pass away naturally. I needed to wrest control of the property from my brother immediately. But taking control meant confronting the very man who held the keys to the kingdom. My grandfather Harlan still held the legal title to the land. As long as Harlan trusted Chase, the toxic dumping would continue. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, turning away from the view. "I will handle my brother. Keep the inspectors at bay." Marcus nodded once, slipping back into the shadows of the study. I walked back toward the lights of the Gala, my mind running complex legal and financial algorithms. I needed to expose Chase to my grandfather, but the old man was fiercely stubborn and deeply entrenched in his conservative beliefs. A simple conversation would never work. I needed irrefutable proof. As I re-entered the crowded ballroom, I saw Chase leading Harlan out of the main house. My grandfather looked frail, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, appeared clouded and unfocused. Chase gripped the old man's arm with a bruising tightness, steering him toward a group of potential investors. Chase was speaking loudly, answering questions on Harlan, behalf treating the patriarch like a silenced prop. The realization hit me with terrifying clarity. Chase was not just manipulating the land, he was actively silencing the only man who could stop him. I watched my grandfather stumble slightly, his movements uncoordinated and sluggish, and I knew instantly that the environmental crimes were only half the story. The real danger was happening right inside the walls of the family home. The following week, the traditional Sunday dinner at the farmhouse felt less like a family gathering and more like a carefully staged theatrical performance. Chase had invited 3 prominent regional agricultural stakeholders to the estate under the guise of discussing the upcoming harvest yields. The real agenda, however, was entirely different. Chase needed to secure unilateral control over the estate before the Environmental Protection Agency could mobilize an inspection of the toxic dumping grounds. To achieve that, he had to prove to the local business community that our grandfather was no longer fit to manage his own legacy. I sat near the foot of the long mahogany dining table, nursing a glass of sparkling water and watching the quiet tragedy unfold. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of roasted lamb and the clinking of heavy silver cutlery. Harlan sat at the head of the table. He wore a crisp tweed suit, but his posture was unnaturally slumped. His hands rested on the white linen tablecloth, trembling with a strange, erratic rhythm. I kept my eyes fixed on Chase, who was seated directly to Harlan right, playing the role of the dutiful, concerned grandson to perfection. He poured wine for the stakeholders and guided the conversation with effortless charm. But my trained eyes caught the subtle, calculated movement of his hands when the dessert course arrived. Chase reached into his tailored vest pocket and retrieved Harlan Daily Pill Organizer. He popped open the evening compartment, but instead of simply handing the prescribed blood pressure medication to the old man, Chase turned his back slightly toward the guests. I saw his thumb press hard against the surface of a secondary pill, crushing a heavy sedative into a fine white powder. With the swift sleight of hand of a seasoned street hustler, he swept the powder directly into Harlan's glass of water and stirred it with a silver spoon. He placed the tainted glass in front of our grandfather, offering a warm, encouraging smile. "Drink up, old man," Chase murmured, his tone dripping with fake affection. "We need to keep your hydration up." Harlan, oblivious to the chemical sabotage, took a long, slow drink. It took less than 15 minutes for the narcotic to breach his system. The stakeholders were in the middle of discussing international grain tariffs when Harlan attempted to join the conversation. He raised a hand to make a point about market fluctuations, but his voice emerged as a thick, unintelligible slur. He blinked rapidly, his head drooping forward as the heavy sedatives scrambled his neural pathways. He tried to pick up his fork, but his fingers lacked the coordination. The heavy silver utensil slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against a porcelain plate and dropping onto the hardwood floor. The three stakeholders stopped eating immediately. They exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances, shifting awkwardly in their high-backed chairs. Chase stood up instantly, rushing to Harlan's side and placing a heavy, patronizing hand on the old man's frail shoulder. "I am so sorry, gentlemen." Chase sighed, projecting a masterful aura of profound exhaustion and quiet grief. "It has been getting worse every single day. The dementia is progressing faster than the neurologist predicted. Some nights he does not even remember his own name. It breaks my heart to see him declining like this, but I am doing everything in my power to keep the farm running smoothly during his twilight years." The stakeholders nodded in sympathetic agreement, murmuring their condolences and praising Chase for his remarkable dedication to the family business. They looked at Harlan not with respect, but with profound pity. They saw a broken, hollow shell of a man entirely incapable of managing a multi-million-dollar agricultural empire. Chase had successfully manipulated the audience. He had painted a flawless public portrait of a tragic cognitive decline, ensuring that no one in the local business sector would ever question his impending hostile takeover. Once the uncomfortable dinner concluded and the stakeholders hurriedly drove their luxury vehicles down the long gravel driveway, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse shifted instantly. The charming, accommodating grandson vanished. Chase dropped the facade the moment the heavy front door clicked shut. Chloe, who had spent the entire evening scrolling through social media on the sofa, poured herself a large glass of red wine and kicked her designer heels onto the coffee table. Chase marched straight into the dining room where I was quietly gathering my coat. He blocked the arched doorway, his towering frame casting a long dark shadow across the Persian rug. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick, stapled legal document, slamming it down onto the polished dining table. "Read it and sign it," Evelyn Chase commanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, serrated whisper. I stepped forward and looked down at the bold lettering across the top page. It was a comprehensive medical power of attorney and a declaration of incapacity. The legal clauses were incredibly severe. By signing the document, Harlan would be officially stripped of his civil liberties. He would lose the right to make his own medical decisions, sign checks, or dictate his place of residence. The paperwork explicitly granted Chase the unilateral authority to forcibly commit our grandfather to a private lockdown nursing facility. "You cannot authorize this without a secondary family signature," I stated, keeping my tone flat and analytical. "The state requires the next of kin to consent to a forced medical committal when the primary caregiver initiates the transfer. That is exactly why you are going to pick up a pen right now," Chase sneered, tapping a rigid finger against the signature line marked for the secondary witness. "I found a lovely private care facility 3 towns over. It is very secure and very quiet. The old man will be out of our hair and I can finally run this estate without his outdated interference." I looked at the document and then directly into my brother's eyes. "I am not signing a piece of paper that sends my grandfather to a rotting facility just so you can operate your dumping ground without supervision." Chase leaned over the table, invading my personal space. The scent of expensive cologne and stale wine washed over me. "You do not have a choice in the matter," he growled, his jaw tightening with unchecked aggression. "If you refuse to sign this release, I will pick up my phone and dial Adult Protective Services. I will file a formal state report claiming that you have been actively neglecting a vulnerable elder." I will tell the investigators that you refuse to authorize essential medical care for a man suffering from severe dementia." Chloe laughed from the living room, taking a slow sip of her wine. "A neglect charge is a felony." "Evelyn," she called out, her voice laced with venomous delight. "I am pretty sure corporate restructuring firms do not hire convicted felons. Your consulting license will be permanently revoked before the weekend. You will lose your fancy city apartment and your entire career just because you wanted to play the stubborn hero." They thought they had constructed an inescapable snare. They believed the threat of criminal charges and the destruction of my professional reputation would force my immediate submission. They expected me to panic, to beg for mercy, or to storm out of the house in a futile rage. They did not realize that threatening a forensic compliance expert with a legal document is like handing a loaded weapon to a sniper. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer a single tear. I reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved my own heavy silver fountain pen. The silence in the dining room became incredibly dense as I pulled the document closer to the edge of the table. I leaned over the thick paper, poising the metal tip over the dotted line. In the realm of high-stakes, corporate litigation executives are trained in specific countermeasures to invalidate forced contracts. I utilized a technique known in federal courts as a duress signature. I deliberately altered the fundamental biomechanics of my handwriting. I changed the sharp angle of my first initial. I disconnected the fluid loops of my last name, and I applied an erratic, heavy pressure that caused the ink to pool unnaturally against the paper fibers. Any certified forensic document examiner looking at that specific signature under magnification would instantly testify that it was executed under severe physical or psychological coercion. I capped my pen and slid the document back across the smooth mahogany surface. I offered Chase a serene, unyielding smile. "The paperwork is all yours, Chase," I said, my voice soft but echoing with lethal intent. Chase snatched the document from the table, his chest puffing out with arrogant triumph. He quickly checked the ink, validating that my name was indeed resting on the dotted line. He let out a loud, mocking scoff, shaking his head as if pitying my weakness. "You always fold when the pressure gets too high, Evelyn," he gloated, slipping the illicit paperwork into his jacket. "You should head back to the city. Let the real adults handle the family legacy." I walked past him, stepping out into the cool night air. Chase honestly believed he had secured the ultimate victory. He thought he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his toxic empire. He had no idea that by forcing me to sign that specific document under the threat of professional ruin, he had just escalated his crimes to a federal level. He had officially committed extortion and fraud, crossing a legal boundary that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I started the engine of my car, watching the lights of the farmhouse fade in my rearview mirror. The medical proxy gave him the illusion of control, but the financial war was only just beginning. Chase needed astronomical amounts of liquid capital to silence the environmental inspectors and cover the mounting bribes for his illegal dumping operation. He was preparing to leverage the poisoned soil against a ruthless Wall Street hedge fund. Unaware that the corporate shark assigned to approve his multi-million-dollar loan was already circling his sinking ship. The illusion of the medical proxy provided Chase with a false sense of invincibility. He operated under the assumption that with our grandfather silenced and me safely banished to the city, he had a clear runway to execute his final catastrophic cash grab. However, running a clandestine toxic waste dumping operation under the guise of a sustainable organic farm requires exorbitant amounts of dark money. The factory executives paying the bribes were demanding tighter security protocols, and the offshore shell accounts Chase used to hide the transactions were bleeding capital to cover Chloe's relentless retail addiction. The Environmental Protection Agency was sniffing around the perimeter, and Chase needed a massive influx of clean capital to finalize his exit strategy before the entire toxic house of cards collapsed. His solution was to target the high-risk lending sector of Wall Street. Chase orchestrated a pitch to Vanguard Capital Partners, a notorious hedge fund known for underwriting aggressive agricultural acquisitions with minimal regulatory oversight. He presented them with a dazzling fabricated portfolio detailing the projected revenue of Heritage Sustainable Organics. He demanded a $15 million commercial loan, offering the pristine 2,000 acres of our generational family farm as the primary collateral. His logic was ruthlessly simple. He intended to secure the massive loan, extract the millions in liquid cash, and ride out the clock until Harlan inevitably passed away. The moment the old man died, Chase planned to execute the immediate sale of the property to the industrial chemical conglomerate, taking a second astronomical payout before the government inspectors ever thought to test the soil. The strategy was bold, but it possessed a glaring structural vulnerability. Wall Street hedge funds do not simply hand over $15 million based on a charming PowerPoint presentation and a handshake. Institutional lenders operating at that tier require an independent third-party forensic audit of the proposed collateral to guarantee the viability of the loan. Vanguard Capital Partners mandated a comprehensive structural review of the agricultural assets before they would authorize the release of the funds. They needed an external firm to verify the environmental compliance and the projected revenue models Chase had so proudly submitted. This bureaucratic requirement was the exact tactical opening I had been waiting for. In the corporate restructuring sector, I do not operate under my given name when dealing with high-stakes acquisitions. My consulting firm uses a heavily obfuscated corporate identity registered in Delaware known as Apex Vanguard Solutions. It is a ghost entity protected by layers of privacy statutes designed specifically to shield my identity from hostile corporate adversaries during sensitive audits. When the request for proposal from the hedge fund crossed the digital bidding platform, I bypassed the standard vetting channels. I leveraged my established industry connections and submitted a heavily discounted expedited timeline for the audit. The hedge fund executives, eager to close the lucrative lending deal, accepted the bid within 24 hours. Chase was completely oblivious. He received a formal notification from his lender stating that a senior compliance officer from Apex Vanguard Solutions had been assigned to review his operational ledgers. He assumed he was dealing with a faceless bureaucrat in a distant city, an auditor he could easily dazzle with fake invoices and smooth talk. He had no idea that the compliance officer holding the power to either approve his massive loan or trigger an immediate federal fraud investigation was the very sister he had threatened just days prior. I initiated the audit from the sterile safety of my downtown office. The initial document dump from Chase accounting software arrived via a secure digital portal. I poured a cup of black coffee, locked my door, and opened the files. It was a chaotic masterpiece of amateur embezzlement. Chase had attempted to bury the illicit bribes from the chemical factories under thousands of lines of fabricated agricultural expenditures. He categorized the nighttime dumping operations as specialized soil amendment deliveries. He coded the offshore wire transfers as international seed procurement. To a standard loan officer scanning for basic debt-to-income ratios, the ledgers might have appeared functional. To a forensic accountant, it was a glaring neon sign pointing directly to federal crimes. I did not flag the anomalies immediately. A premature rejection would only cause Chase to panic, withdraw the loan application, and seek funding from a less scrupulous private lender, where I would lose visibility on his transactions. Instead, I utilized the audit process to tighten the noose. I requested deeper access to his subsidiary accounts, citing standard environmental compliance protocols required by the hedge fund. I demanded the raw data logs, the vendor routing numbers, and the specific GPS coordinates for the supposed soil amendment deliveries. Chase, eager to secure the $15 million, complied with every request, feeding me the exact digital evidence I needed to build a federal indictment. The deeper I dug, the more rotting foundation I uncovered. I tracked the routing numbers connected to the soil amendment vendors. They did not lead to legitimate agricultural suppliers. They led directly to 3 separate industrial manufacturing plants known for producing heavy chemical solvents. Chase was generating fake invoices to cover the cash bribes he received for allowing those exact plants to dump their toxic runoff into the fallow fields on the northern ridge of our property. He was systematically murdering the land to finance his wife diamond collection while simultaneously using that dying land to secure a massive Wall Street loan. The tension escalated when Vanguard Capital Partners requested a preliminary progress report on the audit. They were preparing to authorize the initial transfer of funds and wanted verbal confirmation that the collateral was secure. I sat at my mahogany desk staring at the sprawling digital map of my brother crimes. If I pulled the plug now, the loan would be denied, and Chase would simply pivot to another scam. If I approved the preliminary report, the hedge fund would wire the $15 million directly into his control, giving him the capital he needed to finalize his exit strategy. I picked up the phone and dialed the lead executive at the hedge fund. I authorized the preliminary approval, clearing the path for the transfer. The executive thanked me enthusiastically, completely unaware that I had just his capital. By allowing the loan to proceed, I was letting Chase commit bank fraud on a monumental scale. The moment he accepted that $15 million based on fabricated collateral, he crossed the threshold from local corruption into a severe federal felony. That evening, the security alert on my private phone buzzed. Marcus had sent an encrypted message from his government terminal. The EPA had received an anonymous tip regarding irregular chemical spikes in a municipal water testing facility downstream from the farm. The bureaucratic delay Marcus had orchestrated was crumbling. The agency was mobilizing an emergency strike team to inspect the northern ridge. The timeline had violently accelerated. Chase had the $15 million sitting in a holding account waiting to clear. The environmental inspectors were closing in on the dumping grounds. My grandfather was trapped in a medicated haze inside the farmhouse, his signature, the only thing keeping the legal deed in Chase control. I could not wait for the long game to play out in a courtroom. If the EPA arrived before I secured the physical title to the property, the government would seize the entire estate and auction it off to cover the environmental devastation. The legacy would be erased. I needed the original deed, and I needed to get my grandfather out of that house before Chase realized the trap was already snapping shut around his neck. The fragile equilibrium shattered on a Thursday morning. A localized blood clot in Harlan brain triggered a mild ischemic stroke. Under normal circumstances, a patriarch of his financial stature would have been immediately airlifted to the finest neurological ward in the state. He required elite specialists round-the-clock monitoring and immediate physical therapy. But Chase did not want specialists asking uncomfortable questions about the erratic cocktail of unauthorized sedatives swimming in the old man bloodstream. Armed with the fraudulent medical proxy I had signed under duress, Chase intercepted the paramedics at the estate gates. He redirected the ambulance away from the Premier Medical Center and ordered them to transport our grandfather to Oak Ridge Care Center. Oak Ridge was a notorious poorly funded private facility operating on the fringes of the county. It was a dumping ground where inconvenient relatives were sent to fade away in the shadows out of sight of polite society. The moment Harlan was admitted and confined to a drab, sterile room, Chase did not stay by his bedside to hold his hand. He handed the front desk receptionist a corporate credit card, instructed the nursing staff to deny all visitors, and drove straight to an exclusive country club to play 18 holes of golf with the Vanguard Capital partners. He was celebrating his impending $15 million payout, while the man who built that wealth lay abandoned on a cheap vinyl mattress. In corporate restructuring, timing is the razor edge between saving a company and watching it dissolve into bankruptcy. Right now, my family estate was plummeting toward the latter. Marcus intercepted the hospital transfer logs through a contact in the municipal dispatch office. We knew our window of opportunity was vanishing. If Chase finalized the hedge fund loan tomorrow morning, the property would be legally encumbered by a fraudulent lien, making it nearly impossible to untangle from the incoming environmental forfeiture. We arrived at the Oak Ridge facility just past midnight. The building smelled of industrial bleach, boiled vegetables, and neglect. The front desk was manned by a single exhausted orderly watching a muted television screen. Marcus, wearing his impeccably tailored federal attorney suit, bypassed the desk, entirely projecting the unmistakable aura of government authority. He flashed a generic silver badge from his agency identifying himself as Federal Compliance Oversight. The orderly, intimidated by the sudden arrival of a sharp-suited investigator, did not even ask for a visitor pass. He simply pointed a lazy finger toward the West Wing. We moved swiftly down the flickering fluorescent hallway, our footsteps muffled by the cheap carpet, until we reached room 214. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the rhythmic orange glow of a baseline heart monitor. Harlan lay flat on the narrow bed, staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Without Chase there to grind sedatives into his evening meals, the chemical fog had finally lifted from his mind. The stroke had weakened his left side, leaving his arm resting limply against the thin cotton blanket, but his eyes were sharp. They were piercing, lucid, and filled with a profound, terrifying clarity. The patriarchal arrogance that had defined his entire existence, the stubborn pride that made him declare farming was strictly men work, had been entirely pulverized. He looked at me, and the realization of his own catastrophic misjudgment hung heavily in the stagnant air. He finally understood that the golden grandson he had groomed for decades was nothing but a predator waiting for him to stop breathing. "You came," Harlan whispered, his voice a raspy, fragile echo of the booming baritone that used to command the dining room table. I stepped closer to the foot of the bed, keeping my posture rigid. I did not offer a comforting touch or a sympathetic smile. "I am here because the Environmental Protection Agency is preparing to raid your property," I stated, my tone clinical and detached. "Chase leased the northern ridge to industrial chemical plants. They are dumping toxic waste into the soil. He leveraged the poisoned land to secure a Wall Street loan, and he dumped you in this miserable room so you would not intervene before the check cleared. If the government inspectors arrive before we secure the title, they will seize the entire 2,000 acres. Your legacy will be auctioned off to pay for a federal cleanup." Harlan closed his eyes, a single tear escaping the weathered corner of his eyelid. The devastation of a man realizing his life work had been traded for cheap bribes and luxury cars was palpable in the quiet room. He built an empire with his bare hands, weathering droughts and economic downturns, only to be undone by the very boy he protected. "He betrayed me." Harlan choked out his right hand, gripping the thin bedsheets. "He smiled at me yesterday morning and told me we were buying new tractors. He left me here to die, Evelyn." "I did exactly what you taught him to do," I replied, refusing to sugarcoat the reality. "You taught him that power and land belonged to him by biological right. You handed him the keys without ever making him earn the lock. You treated me like a glorified secretary because I preferred data over driving a combine. Now your chosen heir is burning your house down to pay for his wife diamonds." Marcus stood by the door, keeping a vigilant watch on the quiet corridor. "We do not have time for a family therapy session." Evelyn, Marcus warned, his voice low. "The hedge fund wire transfer clears at dawn. We need the physical deed to intercept the transaction. If Chase secures that capital, he will vanish overseas before the EPA soil tests come back positive." Harlan slowly opened his eyes, turning his head to look at me. The stubborn old farmer was gone, replaced by a defeated man desperate to salvage whatever remained of his name. He reached his functioning right hand behind his neck, fumbling blindly with the harsh stitching of the cheap hospital pillow. His fingers worked frantically, tearing at the seam, until he retrieved a small, dark velvet pouch. He held it out toward me, his hand shaking with immense effort. I stepped forward and took the pouch. Inside rested a heavy brass key bearing the engraved emblem of an elite offshore bank in Zurich. "The original deed is not in the house." Harlan rasped, his breathing shallow and labored. "I never trusted his new accountant. I moved the legacy documents, the mineral rights, and the original property title to a secure deposit box 6 months ago. This is the only physical key. Chase tore my study apart looking for it last month. He thinks it is buried under the floorboards. Take it." I held the cold brass key in my palm, feeling the immense weight of the empire it unlocked. I looked down at the man who had dismissed my career as mere paper-pushing. He was handing me the very foundation of his life because the son he worshipped had become his executioner. "Save the land." Evelyn, Harlan pleaded, his voice cracking with desperate exhaustion. "Do whatever it takes. Do not let him destroy the farm." I slipped the brass key into my blazer pocket. I looked at my grandfather, feeling a cold, strategic calm settle over my mind. The days of seeking his approval were a distant memory. I was operating as a corporate liquidator dealing with a distressed asset. "I will save the land," I stated, my words ringing with a lethal, unyielding certainty. "But understand this, Harlan. The old hierarchy is dead. The farm will no longer operate under your outdated traditions. From this moment forward, it runs exclusively by my rules." Harlan nodded weakly, closing his eyes in silent surrender. He knew he had no leverage left to negotiate. He had traded his pride for survival. I turned my back on the hospital bed and walked toward the door where Marcus was waiting. The brass key was secure, but raw ownership was merely the first step. Chase was still operating under the assumption that the $15 million loan was hitting his account in a few hours. The federal environmental inspectors were still actively preparing their raid. Holding the physical deed was dangerous unless we erected an impenetrable legal shield to deflect the incoming government asset forfeiture. We stepped out of the gloomy clinic and into the crisp night air. Marcus unlocked his vehicle, sliding into the driver's seat, while I opened my laptop in the passenger side. "We need to move faster than the banking system," Marcus said, starting the ignition. "Chase thinks he owns the board. He does not even know we flipped the table," I replied, watching the screen illuminate with encrypted financial portals. "Drive straight to your law office, Marcus. We are going to construct an irrevocable blind trust. We need a legal structure so complex and so heavily fortified that neither the hedge fund nor the federal government can touch a single blade of grass on that property. A legal fortress that strips my grandfather of his personal ownership on paper, rendering Chase incoming mortgage entirely fraudulent." The ultimate financial trap was about to be armed, and Chase would be the one to blindly pull the trigger. The drive to downtown Des Moines felt like a tactical insertion. The streets were deserted, bathed in the harsh orange glow of sodium vapor streetlights. Marcus parked his dark sedan in the underground garage of the federal building, bypassing the standard security checkpoint with his elite credentials. We rode the silent elevator up to the 14th floor, stepping into his expansive corner office. It was a space designed for prosecuting environmental crimes, filled with towering file cabinets and heavy oak furniture. Tonight, however, it served as the war room for the most aggressive corporate restructuring of my career. Possessing the physical deed to the 2,000-acre estate was a critical advantage, but it was severely inadequate against the dual threats barreling toward us. If Marcus activated his agency protocols and the Environmental Protection Agency officially indicted Chase for toxic dumping, the federal government would automatically initiate civil asset forfeiture. Under current statutes, the government seizes properties involved in environmental felonies regardless of who holds the physical paper deed. They would auction the land to fund the multi-million-dollar chemical cleanup, effectively erasing my family legacy. Simultaneously, Chase was hours away from finalizing a $15 million loan using that exact same endangered land as collateral. If the hedge fund wire transfer cleared, the property would be hopelessly encumbered by a massive corporate lien, creating a legal nightmare that could take decades to untangle in civil court. I needed a mechanism that achieved two seemingly impossible objectives simultaneously. I needed to legally strip Harlan of his personal ownership, to invalidate Chase's fraudulent mortgage application while simultaneously creating an impenetrable shield against federal seizure. Marcus loosened his tie and booted up his secure workstation. As a senior attorney for the EPA, he understood the precise mechanics of asset forfeiture. "I understand corporate shell games," Evelyn Marcus said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet office. "But you cannot simply transfer the deed into your name. If the government traces the chemical dumping back to a property owned by the sister of the primary suspect, they will accuse you of complicity. They will freeze your personal accounts and drag you into the RICO indictment." "I am not transferring the deed to myself," I replied, opening my laptop and pulling up a blank legal template. "I am transferring it to a ghost. We are going to build an irrevocable blind trust. In the realm of high wealth management, an irrevocable blind trust is the ultimate defensive fortification. Unlike a standard revocable trust, which the creator can alter or dissolve at any time, an irrevocable trust requires the grantor to permanently surrender all rights, ownership, and control over the assets. Once the ink dries, the property ceases to belong to the individual entirely. It becomes an independent legal entity governed by a strict set of fiduciary rules. If Harlan signed the estate over to this specific trust, he would legally become a penniless man on paper, possessing zero claim to the land he had farmed for 50 years. More importantly, because he no longer owned the collateral, any attempt by Chase to leverage that land for a Wall Street loan would instantly escalate from simple financial mismanagement to bank fraud. Chase would be attempting to mortgage a phantom asset. We spent the next 6 hours drafting the complex legal architecture. Marcus provided the specific environmental liability clauses necessary to insulate the trust from federal forfeiture, while I structured the corporate governance. We registered the trust under a generic alphanumeric designation, obscuring any familial connection. The most critical component of the entire operation was the appointment of the trustee and the sole beneficiary. I did not list myself as Evelyn the granddaughter. I utilized my heavily guarded corporate identity, Apex Vanguard Solutions, as the sole managing entity. I embedded layers of non-disclosure agreements and privacy protections, ensuring that anyone searching the public county records would only see a faceless corporate conglomerate holding the title. By sunrise, the document was a flawless masterpiece of asset protection. It was 40 pages of dense, impenetrable legalese designed to withstand the scrutiny of both Wall Street auditors and federal prosecutors. We printed the final copies, the heavy laser printer humming rhythmically in the silent office. Marcus arranged for an emergency mobile notary, a trusted colleague bound by strict attorney-client privilege, to meet us back at the Oak Ridge Care Center. We arrived at the facility just as the morning shift change was occurring. The exhausted night staff paid us no attention as we slipped back into room 214. Harlan was awake, staring at the blank television screen, his breathing shallow. He looked significantly weaker than the night before, the reality of his stroke and his grandson's betrayal taking a heavy physical toll. I approached the bed and laid the thick stack of documents across his lap. I handed him my silver fountain pen. "The brass key you gave me unlocked the vault, Harlan," I said, keeping my voice devoid of any sentimental warmth. "This document builds the fortress. You are signing an irrevocable blind trust. You are permanently transferring the entire estate, the mineral rights, the water access, and every single acre of land into a corporate entity that I solely control. You will no longer own the farm. Chase will never inherit it. If you sign this, the legacy survives, but your personal empire ends today." Harlan stared at the dense legal text. His proud, weathered hands trembled as he gripped the silver pen. He had spent his entire life dictating terms, controlling his family through the promise of inheritance, and dismissing anyone who did not fit his archaic agricultural worldview. Now his survival depended entirely on the granddaughter he had marginalized. He did not argue. He did not ask for revisions. He pressed the pen to the paper and executed his signature with a shaky but deliberate hand. The notary stepped forward swiftly, stamping the document with a heavy brass seal. The sharp metallic click echoed in the small, sterile room, finalizing the transfer of power. The moment the ink dried, the entire dynamic of the battlefield shifted fundamentally. On paper, the generational family farm simply vanished, absorbed into the belly of Apex Vanguard Solutions. Harlan was now legally destitute. I collected the documents, securing them inside my leather briefcase. "You did the right thing," I told my grandfather, turning toward the door. Marcus and I walked out of the clinic, the crisp morning air hitting my face like a jolt of adrenaline. The trap was now fully operational, but the most dangerous phase was just beginning. Chase was sitting in his executive office, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his feet had just been completely vaporized. He was eagerly anticipating an email from his hedge fund lender confirming the $15 million wire transfer. He believed his fabricated environmental reports and his fraudulent collateral were sufficient to secure the cash. He had no idea that the independent auditor reviewing his loan application was the very sister who now legally owned the asset he was trying to steal. The financial noose was perfectly tied. Now I just needed to tighten it enough to make him panic, and when a narcissist panics, they inevitably make a fatal mistake. The digital trap was primed, and Chase was about to receive a notification that would shatter his entire reality. The digital reverberations of the trust transfer hit the county clerk system late Tuesday afternoon. In the modern financial sector, real estate tracking algorithms operate with terrifying efficiency. Vanguard Capital Partners, utilizing automated risk assessment software, immediately flagged the sudden title change on the property Chase had submitted as his primary collateral. The hedge fund compliance software triggered an automatic hard stop on the pending $15 million wire transfer. Chase, who had been eagerly watching his corporate banking portal, awaiting the massive cash infusion instead, received a glaring red notification alerting him that his loan application was suspended, pending a manual review of ownership discrepancies. The panic must have been instantaneous and absolute. Chase was running a multi-million-dollar toxic waste operation, holding off aggressive chemical executives, expecting immediate land sales and financing his wife exorbitant diamond purchases on credit. He needed that $15 million to keep his fraudulent empire afloat. discovering that the foundational asset of his entire scheme had simply vanished from the public registry completely short-circuited his arrogant reality. He knew Harlan was heavily sedated and isolated at the Oak Ridge Care Center. He knew the estate lawyers were compliant. By simple process of elimination, there was only one person capable of executing such a complex, sophisticated financial maneuver. The attack occurred precisely at 2 a.m. I was sitting in the dark living room of my downtown apartment, reviewing the newly filed trust documents on my secondary monitor. The silence of the building was abruptly shattered by a thunderous, booming crash. The heavy oak door of my apartment splintered inward, the deadbolt ripping straight through the wooden frame with a violent, splintering screech. Chase stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, his custom-tailored suit jacket wrinkled and damp from the night rain. He looked entirely unhinged. The polished, charming persona he projected at agricultural galas had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, predatory desperation. His eyes were bloodshot, and his jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles visibly throbbed. He did not waste time with threats or dramatic monologues. He crossed the living room in 3 massive strides, closing the distance before I could even stand up from my ergonomic chair. He grabbed me by the lapels of my silk blouse, hauling me roughly to my feet and shoving me hard against the plaster wall. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. "What did you do?" Evelyn Chase roared, his voice a guttural, terrifying rasp that echoed through the quiet apartment. His grip tightened, twisting the fabric of my blouse until it dug painfully into my collarbone. The hedge fund just locked my accounts. They said the deed was transferred to a blind trust. I hold the medical power of attorney. I control the estate. Tell me exactly how you bypassed my legal authority, or I swear I will throw you out that window. I maintained my posture, letting my breathing appear shallow and erratic. In physical confrontations, the worst mistake you can make is displaying calm competence. It infuriates the aggressor, pushing them to escalate the violence to assert dominance. I needed Chase to feel powerful. I needed him to believe his physical intimidation was successfully breaking my spirit. I widened my eyes, letting genuine tears of physical discomfort pool in the corners. "I did not bypass anything, Chase," I stammered intentionally, letting my voice tremble and crack. "Grandpa had a secret safety deposit box. He gave me the key at the hospital. The original deed was in there. I just filed the paperwork to protect the land. I did not know about your hedge fund loan. Please let me go." Liar Chase bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "You are a corporate consultant. You knew exactly what you were doing. You thought you could outsmart me, steal the legacy right out from under me." He released his grip on my collar slightly, only to pivot his rage toward my workspace. He noticed the glowing monitor displaying the trust framework. With a sweeping, violent motion, he grabbed my expensive laptop from the desk and hurled it directly onto the hardwood floor. He lifted his heavy leather boot and stomped down repeatedly, crushing the screen and shattering the internal components into a pile of sparking plastic and twisted metal. He pointed a shaking finger at the destroyed hardware. "You have no idea the kind of people I am dealing with." Chase sneered, his breathing ragged. "I owe millions to industrial partners who do not send collection letters. If this loan falls through, they will dismantle my entire life. I am not going to let some paper-pushing sister ruin my empire. You are going to sign a document reversing that trust transfer tomorrow morning, or I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again." I slumped against the wall, sliding down slightly, as if completely overcome by terror. I brought my hands up to cover my face, a defensive posture mimicking total submission. As I shifted my weight, I deliberately nudged a small hidden pocket in my blazer. A sleek metallic USB drive slipped seamlessly from the fabric, clattering softly onto the wooden floorboards right near his boots. It was an incredibly subtle sound, but in the quiet aftermath of the smashed laptop, it caught his immediate attention. Chase froze, looking down at the small silver device. His paranoid, greedy mind instantly jumped to the most logical conclusion. He assumed the destroyed laptop was merely a decoy, and the physical flash drive contained my actual unencrypted files, the backup copies of the trust documents, the communications with the estate lawyers, and my forensic notes. He bent down and snatched the USB drive from the floor, a cruel, victorious smirk spreading across his face. "You always were too predictable," Evelyn Chase mocked, tossing the drive lightly in his palm. "Keeping physical backups is a rookie mistake. I am taking this. Do not even think about calling the police or reporting the break-in. If you do, I will release the footage of Harlan signing the initial power of attorney, and I will bury you in civil litigation for elder fraud. You lost. Accept it." He turned on his heel and marched out of the ruined doorway, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. He left me sitting on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and broken plastic, firmly believing he had just crushed my rebellion and secured his ultimate triumph. I waited until the sound of his engine faded into the distant city traffic. I did not bother checking the destroyed laptop. It was a burner device purchased entirely in cash, specifically for this confrontation. The tears on my face dried, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating serenity. I stood up, brushed the dust from my trousers, and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Chase thought he had just confiscated my primary weapon. He had absolutely no idea that he was carrying a ticking digital time bomb directly into the heart of his fraudulent operation. The USB drive he so eagerly pocketed did not contain trust documents or legal notes. It was loaded with a highly sophisticated military-grade Trojan payload specifically engineered by an elite cybersecurity contact from my corporate network. The moment. Chase inserted that drive into his executive computer at the Heritage Sustainable Organics headquarters. The malware would execute silently in the background, bypassing his commercial firewalls without triggering a single antivirus alert. I sat at my kitchen island, opening a secondary secure tablet. I initiated a secure encrypted connection to Marcus' private federal server. Now we wait. The wait was surprisingly short. Less than 2 hours later, at 4 a.m, my tablet screen flashed a brilliant neon green. The Trojan had successfully breached the target network. Chase, driven by sheer panic and an arrogant need to review his stolen prize, had plugged the drive directly into his primary terminal. The malware did not destroy his system. It operated as a digital vacuum. It immediately began scraping his hidden directories, bypassing his encrypted folders, and copying every single byte of data. I watched the data stream populate on my screen. It was a torrential flood of devastating evidence. The Trojan extracted the raw, unredacted emails between Chase and the chemical plant executives, detailing the exact schedules and locations for the toxic waste dumping. It pulled the offshore routing numbers used to launder the bribe money into Chloe personal accounts. Most incredibly, it found a hidden ledger explicitly tracking the fraudulent USDA organic subsidies, demonstrating exactly how he diverted federal funds to pay for his country club memberships. I routed the entire data payload directly into the secure federal servers managed by Marcus at the EPA. We possessed the physical deed securing the land from forfeiture, and now we possess the undeniable digital confessions required to secure a federal indictment. Chase had unknowingly built his own prison cell and handed me the key. But the trap was not complete until the audience arrived. Chase was planning a highly publicized funeral to cement his status as the grieving heir, unaware that I was orchestrating a spectacular public execution. 2 weeks after the digital breach, the inevitable occurred. My grandfather Harlan passed away quietly in his sterile room at the Oak Ridge Care Center. The massive stroke had severely weakened his system, but I knew the profound realization that his legacy was being dismantled by his own grandson had ultimately broken his spirit. The news of his passing rippled through the agricultural community, triggering a wave of obligatory mourning from the local politicians and business leaders who had profited from his influence. For Chase, however, the death was not a tragedy. It was the starting gun. The final obstacle preventing his liquidation of the 2,000-acre estate had officially been removed. The funeral was held on a humid Thursday afternoon at the sprawling generational cemetery located just on the edge of the property line. The event was entirely devoid of genuine grief. Chase had orchestrated the service to function as an aggressive networking gala. The guest list heavily prioritized wealthy investors, local zoning officials, and the very chemical plant executives he was actively colluding with. The sprawling green lawns of the cemetery were dotted with black luxury SUVs and sleek sedans. I stood near the back of the gathering, wearing a simple black tailored suit, maintaining a respectful distance from the main procession. Chase and Chloe were positioned at the front, operating like royalty surveying their new kingdom. Chase wore a bespoke dark Italian suit projecting an aura of stoic leadership. He vigorously shook hands with the chemical executives accepting their hollow condolences, while subtly reassuring them that the pending $30 million land sale would proceed without delay. Chloe, dressed in a form-fitting black designer dress and a wide-brimmed hat, treated the funeral like a fashion editorial. She dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, leaning heavily on Chase's arm to maximize the dramatic optics for the local press, snapping photos nearby. The hypocrisy was suffocating. They were burying the patriarch of our family while simultaneously finalizing the details to poison the very earth he was being laid to rest in. I watched them perform, noting the distinct predatory energy radiating from my brother. He believed the hedge fund freeze was a temporary bureaucratic glitch easily resolved once the official will reading verified his primary heir status. He assumed the stolen USB drive contained nothing but my futile attempts to document his aggressive accounting. He felt entirely untouchable. Following the brief graveside service, the family and select VIP guests were directed to the main farmhouse for the reception. I walked up the long gravel driveway, intending to retrieve a few remaining personal items I had stored in my childhood bedroom. As I approached the heavy oak front doors, I noticed a bright yellow slip of paper taped directly above the brass handle. It was an official notice from a private security firm. I reached out to test the handle. The familiar mechanism was gone, replaced by a heavy-duty commercial-grade digital smart lock. Chase had acted with breathtaking speed. While the attendees were paying their respects at the cemetery, he had dispatched a private contractor to change every single lock on the estate. He was systematically severing my physical access to the property before the ink on the death certificate was even dry. I stepped back from the porch and walked around the side of the house toward the secondary entrance near the old mudroom. Sitting haphazardly on the damp grass was a collection of cardboard boxes and black trash bags. I recognized the contents immediately: my winter coats, a stack of university textbooks, and a small box containing my mother-old photographs. Chase had ordered his staff to literally throw my belongings out of the house. It was a crude, aggressive assertion of dominance designed to publicly humiliate me and solidify his complete control over the estate. Before I could even reach down to pick up the scattered photographs, the sharp clicking of stilettos echoed against the flagstone patio. Chloe descended the back stairs holding a glass of expensive champagne, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the afternoon sun. She stopped a few feet away from my discarded belongings, looking down at the cardboard boxes with an expression of supreme, unadulterated disgust. I thought the security notice on the front door was clear enough. Evelyn, Chloe said, her voice a venomous whisper that barely carried over the ambient noise of the reception happening inside. Chase told you the estate is undergoing immediate restructuring. We cannot have unauthorized personnel wandering the grounds during the transition. You need to gather your trash and leave the property immediately. I slowly straightened my posture, looking directly into her eyes. The sheer arrogance required to stand on my family property drinking champagne purchased with stolen funds and demand. My exit was staggering. I am simply retrieving my personal items, Chloe, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of the emotional reaction she was desperately trying to provoke. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, swirling the champagne in her crystal flute. "You really do not understand how this works, do you?" she sneered, taking a step closer. "The old man is dead. His archaic rules died with him. Chase owns everything now. The land, the house, the accounts. You are a nobody, Evelyn. A loser who plays with spreadsheets while real adults build empires. You need to learn your place. Do not make us call the police to escort you off our property. It would be terribly embarrassing for you to be arrested for trespassing at your own grandfather's funeral." The threat was explicit and entirely devoid of class. They were high on their own perceived power, treating me like a disposable nuisance. I did not argue. I did not attempt to explain the intricate web of federal crimes currently wrapping around their throats. Engaging in a screaming match in the mudroom driveway would only validate their illusion of control. I calmly bent down, picked up the box of photographs, and tucked it under my arm. "I will see you at the will reading, Chloe," I said, offering her a serene, chilling smile. "I am sure it will be a highly illuminating event for everyone involved." Chloe rolled her eyes, dismissing me completely, as she turned her back and walked gracefully back up the stairs toward the lavish reception. She truly believed she had just won a decisive victory. She had no idea that her petty, cruel eviction was merely the final stage dressing for the massacre I had meticulously prepared. I walked back to my car, placing the box in the passenger seat. The aggressive lockout and the public humiliation confirmed exactly what I needed to know. Chase was accelerating his timeline. He was desperate to finalize his authority to satisfy his anxious investors and chemical partners. A quick review of my secure email server confirmed the schedule. The formal reading of the will was set for noon on Friday. It was not a private family affair. Chase had aggressively invited the legal representatives from the chemical conglomerate to attend the reading, hoping to immediately sign the $30 million land sale contract the moment the lawyer confirmed his inheritance. He wanted to execute a seamless transition of power in front of his wealthy buyers. I sat in the driver's seat watching the expensive cars pulling out of the estate. They were throwing a massive celebration, totally unaware that they were dancing on top of a highly volatile federal trap. The Trojan payload Marcus deployed was actively transmitting daily updates to the EPA and the DOJ. The irrevocable blind trust was filed and legally unassailable. Chase had booked the most important meeting of his life for noon on Friday, completely ignorant of the fact that I had designed an invisible, merciless guillotine, specifically calibrated to drop at that exact hour. The profound silence inside the mahogany boardroom was broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing of my brother. Chase stared at the heavy red seal on the legal document, his mind violently rejecting the reality crashing down around him. He had spent months meticulously planning his corporate takeover, drugging our grandfather, and alienating me from the family. He thought he possessed absolute control over the estate. The concept that an invisible corporate entity had snatched the 2,000 acres right out from under his nose was entirely incomprehensible to his arrogant brain. "Who is Apex Vanguard Solutions?" Chase demanded, slamming his hand flat against the polished table. The impact rattled the crystal water glasses resting near the center. "What kind of shell company is this? I will sue them into bankruptcy. I will drag whoever runs this fake trust through federal court until they surrender the deed." Arthur Sterling did not flinch at the outburst. The seasoned attorney simply adjusted his glasses and looked down at the final page of the heavily fortified legal document. He traced a line of text with his silver pen, preparing to deliver the precise piece of information that would permanently shatter my fragile empire. "You will not need to look very far to find the managing director of the trust." Chase Sterling stated, his voice projecting a calm, lethal authority that silenced the entire room. The irrevocable blind corporate trust was established specifically to ensure the long-term preservation of the agricultural legacy. According to the federally ratified Articles of Incorporation, the sole executive beneficiary and the exclusive managing director of Apex Vanguard Solutions is sitting right at the end of this table. Sterling paused, lifting his gaze to meet mine before completing his sentence. "The estate is now entirely under the legal control of Evelyn." The effect was instantaneous and physically jarring. The violent flush of aggressive crimson red that had dominated Chase's face just seconds ago evaporated completely. The blood rushed violently from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of ashen gray. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his parachute fail to deploy mid-air. Chloe, who had been nervously biting her lip near the window, gasped loudly. Her manicured fingers went limp. The expensive designer pen she had been holding slipped from her grasp and hit the glass surface of the side table with a loud, sharp clatter. She stared at me, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, realizing the woman she had just mocked in the mudroom driveway was now the absolute owner of the ground she stood on. He was out of his mind, Chase roared suddenly, kicking his chair backward. The heavy wooden legs shrieked against the floorboards. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at me. "This is a fraud. That signature is entirely forged. You manipulated a sick, dying old man into signing away my birthright. You probably drugged him just to get his fingerprint on that paper." I remained seated, maintaining a perfectly serene expression. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend myself against his hysterical projection. I simply let the silence amplify his desperate, pathetic unraveling. The three chemical executives seated across the table exchanged panicked glances. They were high-level operators accustomed to navigating complex legal gray areas, but dealing with a hostile familial corporate takeover involving a blind trust was a catastrophic liability. The lead executive, a man with a sharp, calculating gaze, began packing his files into his leather briefcase, preparing to abandon the sinking ship. "Do not move," Chase shouted, noticing the executive retreat. He lunged toward his own briefcase, frantically tearing through the latches. He pulled out a thick stack of documents stamped with the official seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. He slammed the papers down onto the table, pointing aggressively at the federal logos. "I still hold the cards here," Chase declared, his voice pitching into a manic, desperate register. "I am the registered operational CEO of Heritage Sustainable Organics. I secured millions in federal funding for green technology upgrades on that specific land. Under federal statutes regulating agricultural grants, my company possesses eminent domain override capabilities if the land is deemed critical for ongoing government-subsidized projects." He turned toward the chemical executives, his eyes wide and unhinged, presenting a deeply flawed legal theory as if it were absolute salvation. "You do not need to worry about her little fake trust," Chase assured them, his breathing shallow and rapid. "I hold the federal contracts. I have operational supremacy. I can force a compulsory acquisition of the land through the grant clauses. The $30 million sale is still perfectly viable. We are signing the contract today." The sheer audacity of his delusion was staggering. He honestly believed he could utilize a fraudulent federal grant application to execute a forced government seizure against an irrevocable blind trust managed by a forensic restructuring expert. He was attempting to use his own embezzlement scheme as a legal shield. The lead chemical executive paused, his hand resting on the handle of his briefcase. He looked at Chase, then looked down the length of the table at me. I was evaluating the battlefield, trying to determine if Chase's desperate gambit held any actual legal weight, or if he was simply watching a lunatic drown in his own lies. I decided it was time to actively participate in the execution. I slowly uncrossed my legs, placed my hands flat on the mahogany surface, and stood up. The charcoal gray suit I wore no longer looked like the uniform of a compliant sibling. It looked like armor. "You are referencing the USDA Environmental Transition Grants." "Chase," I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, chilling precision that instantly lowered the temperature in the boardroom. "The funding you secured by claiming you were implementing synthetic pesticide reduction and overhauling the irrigation systems." "Yes," Chase snapped, puffing out his chest, trying to reclaim his shattered authority. "Federal funding, Evelyn. It supersedes your little paper trick. The government wants that land operational, and I am the one managing the operations." I smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that caused Chloe to shrink further back into her leather chair. "It is fascinating that you would bring up those specific environmental grants in a room full of people hoping to purchase that land," I noted, walking slowly around the edge of the table. "Because securing federal funding requires rigorous adherence to environmental compliance. And based on my preliminary audit of your operations, your definition of compliance is highly creative." I stopped pacing and stopped directly across from the three chemical executives. They were staring at me, their predatory instincts warning them that the ground beneath their feet was about to collapse. Chase thought his federal grants were a shield, but he had completely forgotten that accepting government money invites severe, unforgiving federal scrutiny. The trap he had so blindly walked into was no longer just about inheriting a farm. It was about surviving the impending legal massacre. The heavy mahogany boardroom felt suffocatingly tense as my words settled over the desperate display of bravado Chase was attempting to project. He stood near his chair, practically vibrating with a chaotic, frantic energy, pointing a trembling finger at the USDA folders. He was completely blinded by his own arrogance, convinced that a stack of fraudulent grant applications could somehow bulldoze a federally ratified blind trust. He thought the mention of government projects would intimidate me into silence. That was exactly the moment I had meticulously calculated. I broke eye contact with the chemical executives and calmly reached down to the floor where my sleek black leather briefcase rested. The distinct sharp click of the brass locks echoing in the silent room drew every gaze toward me. I did not pull out a single sheet of paper or a printed email. I extracted a massive 3-inch thick binder bound tightly in deep red vinyl. It looked less like a legal document and more like a physical weapon. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I placed the heavy binder onto the polished surface of the table and slid it forcefully down the center. It glided across the wood, coming to a precise halt directly in front of the lead CEO from the industrial chemical conglomerate. Before any of you even consider placing a signature on a $30 million land acquisition contract with a man who holds absolutely zero legal equity, I suggest you review the contents of that specific dossier. I announced, my voice dropping into a chilling, lethal register. You are not purchasing 2,000 acres of pristine agricultural development land, gentlemen. You are currently negotiating to buy an active federal environmental crime scene. Chase froze. The manic confidence that had fueled his rant about eminent domain vanished instantly. He stared at the red binder, his eyes wide and bloodshot, struggling to process the sudden strategic shift. He had anticipated a fight over inheritance rights, but the mention of environmental crimes was an entirely different, unmapped battlefield. "What the hell is she talking about?" Chase stammered, turning to the lead CEO. "Do not look at that. It is just more of her fabricated spreadsheet garbage. She is trying to tank the deal." The lead executive, a man who managed billions in corporate liabilities, did not listen to the panicking farmer. He recognized the heavy red binder as a forensic audit portfolio. He unclasped the cover and flipped the binder open. The two other executives leaned in close, their eyes scanning the documents with the rapid, calculating efficiency of predators smelling blood in the water. The first page they encountered was not a spreadsheet. It was a high-resolution satellite photograph authorized by the Environmental Protection Agency. The image displayed the northern ridge of the generational farm, capturing a convoy of unmarked tanker trucks actively discharging dark sludge directly into the fallow soil under the cover of night. The executive flipped to the next tab. The page was a detailed chemical analysis report outlining severe contamination levels of heavy industrial solvents penetrating the local aquifer. The numbers highlighted in stark red ink were catastrophic. I did not let the silence stretch. I narrated the destruction with surgical precision, ensuring every individual in the room understood the exact magnitude of the liability resting on the table. My brother did not secure USDA funding to implement sustainable organic farming, I explained, pacing slowly behind my chair. He secured those grants as a superficial cover story while he leased the fallow acreage to your competitors in the next county over. He allowed them to dump thousands of gallons of toxic manufacturing waste directly into the earth in exchange for steep offshore bribes. Chase lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the table. "You are lying!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You hacked my private servers. That is illegally obtained data. It is inadmissible." The admission of the hack was a spectacular tactical blunder. By claiming the data was illegally obtained, he effectively verified its authenticity right in front of his prospective buyers. The executives did not care about the legality of my methods. They cared about the millions of dollars in federal cleanup fines currently attached to the land they were trying to purchase. The lead CEO turned the final page of the summary section. He was staring at the raw, unredacted digital ledgers the Trojan malware had extracted from Chase executive computer. The ledger matched the offshore wire transfers directly to the dates of the nocturnal dumping operations. It was an airtight, undeniable paper trail of extreme environmental sabotage and blatant money laundering. The executive slammed the red binder shut with a force that made Chloe jump in her seat near the window. He did not look at the documents anymore. He looked directly at Chase, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You tried to sell us a toxic landfill," the executive growled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous corporate fury. "You attempted to offload a multi-million-dollar EPA Superfund site onto our balance sheets while simultaneously defrauding the federal government. If my board had signed that acquisition contract today, our entire corporate entity would have been legally tethered to this environmental disaster. It is a minor zoning issue." Chase babbled, desperate sweat pouring down his face as he watched his $30 million exit strategy disintegrate. "We can bury the soil tests. We can pay off the local municipal water inspectors. The deal is still clean. I promise you the deal is clean." The three executives stood up in perfect synchronization. The lead CEO picked up the thick draft of the land sale contract resting near his briefcase. With a sharp, violent motion, he ripped the heavy paper directly down the middle, tearing the multi-million-dollar agreement into useless, jagged halves. He tossed the shredded contract directly into Chase's chest. "We are done," the executive stated, grabbing his leather briefcase. "If you ever attempt to contact our conglomerate again, my legal team will personally forward this entire dossier to the Department of Justice." They did not wait for a response. The three men marched swiftly out of the mahogany boardroom, leaving the heavy double doors swinging wide open behind them. They were fleeing the epicenter of a massive federal implosion, desperate to distance their corporate reputations from the radioactive fallout. Chase stood paralyzed, watching the empty doorway. The $30 million he desperately needed to cover his mounting debts, pay off his silent partners, and maintain his illusion of supreme wealth had just walked out of the room. He was left entirely alone, stripped of his leverage, his inheritance, and his financial escape route. He turned slowly toward me, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with the unhinged, terrifying realization that he possessed absolutely nothing but a mountain of toxic debt. But the financial bleeding was not over, and the true masterstroke of the corporate trap was about to unleash a secondary devastating blow from a direction he never anticipated. The physical absence of the chemical executives created a vacuum in the boardroom rapidly filled by Chase, escalating manic panic. The $30 million land sale was completely dead. The environmental bribes were exposed. The inheritance he had plotted to steal was locked safely behind the impenetrable wall of the blind trust. Yet instead of collapsing in defeat, the narcissist brain scrambled for a secondary survival route. He possessed a fallback plan, an emergency parachute he believed was entirely immune to my interference. "You think you won?" Evelyn Chase hissed, his voice dropping to a guttural, desperate pitch. "You think showing a few dirt samples to some executives ruined me?" He backed away from the mahogany table, his hands trembling violently as he reached deep into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone, his thumb frantically swiping across the glass screen. "I do not need their $30 million, Chase sneered, pulling up a secure banking application. "I already secured a massive line of credit from Vanguard Capital Partners. $15 million in liquid cash dropped into my primary holding account at 9 o'clock this morning. It is clean, untraceable Wall Street money. I am going to wire every single cent of that $15 million directly into my offshore accounts right now." He tapped the screen aggressively, initiating the massive international transfer protocol. He glared at me, his bloodshot eyes burning with a toxic mixture of triumph and pure, unadulterated hatred. "I am going to take that cash, and I am going to hire a team of the most ruthless litigators in the country. I will tie your little blind trust up in federal court for decades. I will sue you for corporate espionage, defamation, and elder abuse until you are begging to work a cash register just to afford rent. You are not walking out of this." Chloe, sitting by the window, suddenly sat up straighter. The mention of the $15 million reignited the dying embers of her greed. She smoothed her designer dress, her confidence momentarily restored by the promise of massive liquidity. "Yes," Chloe chimed in, her voice shrill and vindictive. "We still have the hedge fund money. We can just leave the country and let the government deal with the stupid farm. Just transfer the funds, Chase." I remained standing at the far end of the long table, watching my brother frantically input his security pins to authorize the massive wire transfer. He truly believed he had outsmarted the system. I thought the high-risk lending sector operated in a vacuum, entirely disconnected from the forensic reality of his crimes. He was attempting to execute the ultimate exit strategy, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing on a trapdoor I had personally constructed. I did not raise my voice to stop him. I did not rush across the room to snatch the phone from his hands. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer and retrieved a sleek, flat digital tablet. I pressed the power button, waking the screen. "Are you currently attempting to execute an international wire transfer using the capital provided by Vanguard Capital Partners, Chase?" I asked, my voice echoing with a chilling clinical detachment. Chase sneered, looking up from his phone screen for a fraction of a second. "That is exactly what I'm doing, you stupid paper pusher. The money is mine. The collateral cleared the audit yesterday. You cannot touch it. It is incredibly unfortunate that you were too busy preparing your victory speech this morning to check your primary corporate email inbox, I stated, tapping a single sequence on my tablet. Because if you had bothered to read the notifications from your lender, you would realize that executing that transfer is mathematically impossible. Chase froze his thumb, hovering mere millimeters above the final confirmation button on his banking app. A microscopic tremor of doubt fractured his arrogant facade. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The independent audit cleared. The compliance officer signed off on the agricultural valuation. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. That is the fundamental problem with aggressive, high-risk borrowing, Chase. You assume the compliance officers reviewing your ledgers are faceless bureaucrats sitting in distant cubicles. You assume they are easily fooled by fabricated invoices and fake soil amendment deliveries. I stopped near the center of the table, turning the tablet screen so he could see the digital display. The screen illuminated a highly classified internal banking dashboard, displaying the exact routing protocols for Vanguard Capital Partners. You should really pay closer attention to the corporate entities you engage with. I continued, dropping the final devastating piece of the puzzle into place. The independent auditing firm, the hedge fund hired to review your $15 million loan application, was Apex Vanguard Solutions. The realization hit him with the force of a physical strike. His jaw went completely slack. The name of the auditing firm was the exact same corporate entity that now permanently held the deed to the family farm. The faceless compliance officer, who had scrutinized his fraudulent environmental records, demanded access to his subsidiary accounts, and ultimately possessed the unilateral authority to approve or deny the massive loan, was standing directly in front of him. "I am the compliance officer, Chase," I declared, delivering the lethal blow with absolute precision. "I approved the preliminary review to keep you docile, but at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I issued the final binding forensic report directly to the senior partners at the hedge fund. I confirmed that the primary collateral you offered, the 2,000-acre estate, does not legally belong to you. Furthermore, I submitted the satellite imagery, proving the land is severely contaminated, drastically plummeting its overall market value." Chase stared at me, his chest heaving, his brain violently rejecting the catastrophic reality. "No," he gasped, shaking his head frantically. "The money is in my account. I saw the balance this morning. The funds cleared." "They did clear," I agreed, offering a cold, merciless smile. "But when a hedge fund discovers a borrower has utilized unowned, severely depreciated assets to secure a massive loan, they do not simply send a polite letter asking for the money back. They activate their emergency fraud retrieval protocols." I pointed a steady finger toward the smartphone still clutched in his sweating hand. "Go ahead, Chase. Hit confirm. Try to wire the $15 million to your offshore accounts." Chase looked down at the glowing screen. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. He pressed his thumb against the confirmation button, desperately trying to push the stolen capital out of the country. The banking application screen froze for 2 agonizing seconds. A small blue circle spun, mocking his panic. Then the entire interface shifted. The standard account overview vanished, replaced by a glaring, stark red warning banner stretching across the display. "Transaction denied. Account frozen. Contact fraud department immediately." Chase let out a strangled, horrifying wheeze. He tapped the screen repeatedly, his fingers slapping against the glass in a manic, futile rhythm. He refreshed the application, pulling up the master balance dashboard. The $15 million was gone, entirely recalled by the hedge fund. But the devastation did not stop there. The red banner applied to every single line of credit attached to his profile. His primary checking accounts, his business operating funds, his personal savings. The balance glaring back at him in stark red numbers across every single account was exactly $0.00. You attempted to leverage a property you did not own to extract $15 million from a federally insured lending institution. I explained, my voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. That is the textbook definition of bank fraud. Vanguard Capital Partners did not just recall the loan chase. They initiated a hard federal freeze on every single financial asset bearing your name to cover the breach of contract penalties. You are completely and permanently bankrupt. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She dropped her phone, completely abandoning her curated social media persona. She scrambled out of her leather chair, rushing toward Chase and grabbing his arm. "Tell me she is lying," Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly. "Tell me we still have the money. I have debts, Chase. The credit card companies are going to seize everything." Chase could not answer her. He stared at the red error screen, his entire empire reduced to a string of zeros. The arrogant golden grandson, the man who thought he could poison the earth, steal an inheritance, and outsmart Wall Street, was officially a destitute criminal standing in a borrowed suit. But the absolute finality of his destruction was not yet complete. The financial execution merely set the stage for the physical reckoning, and the heavy footsteps marching rapidly down the exterior hallway signaled that the ultimate authorities had finally arrived to collect their dues. The agonizing silence following the collapse of Chase Financial Empire was violently ruptured by the heavy, solid oak doors of the boardroom bursting open. They did not swing wide with the polite hesitation of a confused receptionist or the measured caution of building security. They were thrust apart with the overwhelming kinetic force of a coordinated tactical raid. The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls, rattling the framed legal credentials hanging nearby. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantaneously from the sterile tension of a corporate dispute to the rigid, electrified reality of an active federal law enforcement operation. 6 heavily armed agents poured into the room, moving with synchronized, breathtaking efficiency. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs, clearly identifying them as operatives for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency Criminal Investigation Division. They fanned out rapidly, establishing absolute perimeter control, blocking the exits, and ensuring no one moved a single muscle. Stepping through the threshold immediately behind the tactical entry team was Marcus. He did not look like the quiet, accommodating brother-in-law who patiently endured insufferable holiday dinners. He had completely shed his domestic camouflage. Dressed in a razor-sharp dark suit with a federal badge clipped prominently to his belt, he projected the unyielding, lethal authority of a senior government prosecutor. His posture was rigid, his dark eyes scanning the room with the cold, detached calculation of a predator cornering its prey. The 2 junior defense attorneys Chase had brought along, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of the situation, immediately stepped back, raising their hands in a universal gesture of total surrender. They were smart enough to recognize a multi-agency federal takedown and absolutely refused to interfere or risk obstruction charges for a client who was clearly already legally dead. Chase, staring at the sudden influx of federal agents, visibly deteriorated. The smartphone displaying his frozen zero balance accounts slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany table. He took a stumbling, erratic step backward, his knees physically buckling under the crushing weight of his newly manifested reality. Chase Vance Marcus announced, his deep, resonant baritone cutting through the chaotic energy of the raid. The voice carried no familial warmth, no lingering trace of personal connection. It was the voice of the United States justice system delivering a final, devastating verdict. You are under arrest for systemic federal wire fraud, the illicit procurement of agricultural subsidies from the United States Department of Agriculture, and gross criminal violations of the Clean Water Act. Marcus stepped closer, ensuring his proximity emphasized the inescapable gravity of the charges. Furthermore, based on the digital evidence retrieved from your executive terminal, you are being formally indicted for conspiracy to commit money laundering and the intentional hazardous contamination of municipal aquifers. Chase's chest heaved with rapid, shallow, panic-induced gasps. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route, a sympathetic face, or a legal loophole that simply did not exist. The realization that his entire illegal enterprise, his bribes, his fake green initiatives, and his arrogant land grabs had been entirely dismantled by the brother-in-law. He routinely mocked, finally penetrated his arrogant skull. But the federal execution was not restricted solely to my brother. Marcus smoothly pivoted his piercing gaze toward the woman cowering near the vaded window. Chloe had pressed herself flat against the glass, her designer dress offering no protection against the impending legal slaughter. She was clutching her diamond tennis bracelet, shaking so violently her teeth were audibly chattering. "And you," Chloe Vance Marcus continued his tone, shifting to a sharp, merciless pitch, "you are also under arrest." Chloe let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek, shaking her head frantically. "No, no," she wailed, raising her hands defensively. "I did not do anything. I do not run the farm. I do not know anything about the chemical dumping. He did it all." She pointed a frantic, trembling finger directly at her husband, instantly betraying him in a desperate, pathetic bid for self-preservation. "Your ignorance regarding the environmental sabotage is irrelevant to your specific charges," Marcus countered, cleanly slicing through her frantic defense. "You are being arrested for active complicity in bank fraud and accessory to money laundering. The Federal Financial Task Force verified that you knowingly submitted fraudulent income declarations to secure commercial credit lines. You utilized capital funneled through offshore shell companies to purchase luxury assets, effectively laundering the proceeds of your husband's environmental crimes." Two female federal agents immediately closed the distance separating Chloe from the window. They grabbed her arms with practiced, uncompromising force, hauling her away from the glass. She thrashed weakly, screaming about her social status and demanding to call her parents, but the agents swiftly pinned her wrists behind her back. The harsh, metallic clicking of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply across the quiet boardroom, finalizing her descent from a high society socialite to a federal inmate. Watching his wife shackled and dragged toward the door, shattered whatever microscopic fragments of defiance Chase still harbored. The arrogant agrarian visionary who believed he was untouchable completely collapsed. His legs gave out, and he dropped heavily to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. He ignored the federal agents surrounding him entirely, fixing his desperate, bloodshot eyes directly on me. The sneering, condescending brother who had laughed at my career and threatened to throw me out of my own family home was gone. He was replaced by a weeping, terrified shell begging for salvation from the very woman he tried to destroy. "Evelyn, please!" Chase sobbed, raw tears streaming down his face, ruining the collar of his bespoke suit. He crawled forward slightly, his hands reaching out toward the hem of my trousers. "Please do not let them do this. We are blood. We are family. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but you cannot let them send me to federal prison." He stared up at me, his face contorted in an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated fear. "You are the sole director of the trust now. You control the narrative. You have the power to stop this. Tell Marcus it was a misunderstanding. Tell him we were just negotiating an internal corporate restructure. I will give you everything. I will sign whatever you want. Please, Evelyn, I am begging you have some mercy." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor. I did not step back. I did not avert my gaze. I wanted to absorb every single detail of his total humiliation. He was attempting to weaponize the biological connection he had spent years treating like a disposable convenience. He wanted me to feel a profound sisterly obligation, ignoring the fact that just 48 hours prior he had broken down my apartment door and threatened to destroy my career. "I am not the director of your salvation, Chase," I stated, my voice resonating with a cold, absolute detachment that silenced his pathetic sobbing. "I am simply the auditor who finalized your ledger. You did not make a mistake. You orchestrated a calculated, massive criminal enterprise. You drugged our grandfather. You poisoned the earth, and you tried to extort me using a forged medical proxy." I leaned down slightly, ensuring he could look directly into my eyes and see the impenetrable titanium wall he had crashed into. "You demanded that I learn my place, Chase." I whispered the words, echoing with lethal precision. "This is my place. I am the woman holding the deed to the empire you tried to steal, and your place is at the bottom of a federal indictment." I straightened my posture, turning my back on him completely. I looked at Marcus, offering a single firm nod. The execution was complete. The cleanup process could finally begin. Marcus gestured to the tactical team. "Take him down to processing." The agents hauled Chase off the floor, gripping his arms with overwhelming force. He did not fight them. The absolute realization that I would not save him, that his biological leverage was entirely worthless, broke his spirit entirely. He hung his head, his tears dripping onto the hardwood as they secured the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. I was marched out of the boardroom, a broken, destitute criminal, leaving behind the phantom ashes of the empire he tried to steal. The legal trap had sprung perfectly, but the true public reckoning, the spectacle that would permanently eradicate his fraudulent legacy from the local community, was actively waiting for him right outside the front doors of the law firm. I looked down straight into the desperate, bloodshot eyes of the man who had physically assaulted me, who had threatened to ruin my professional career, and who had tried to steal my grandfather's remaining years for a payout. He was kneeling on the polished floor, his expensive suit wrinkled, his arrogant facade entirely eradicated. He searched my face looking for a shred of the compliant sister he thought he could control. He found a void. Blood does not make a family. Chase. I stated, my voice flat and devoid of any lingering familial attachment. It is merely a biological coincidence. The power I hold is meant to protect this legacy. It will never be used to shield a parasite. Marcus, recognizing the finality of the exchange, gave a sharp, authoritative hand signal. The federal tactical agents immediately converged. They did not handle Chase with the gentle deference usually afforded to white-collar criminals. They gripped his arms with overwhelming physical force, wrenching them aggressively behind his back. The sharp, distinctive clack of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed across the silent boardroom. But the execution of Chase's fraudulent empire was not confined to the walls of the law firm. A private arrest would allow him to spin a narrative later, to claim a misunderstanding or a quiet settlement. Marcus understood that to permanently neutralize a narcissist, you must obliterate their public image. The penalty required a spectacle. Marcus did not instruct the tactical team to escort Chase and Chloe down the freight elevator or out the discreet rear loading dock. He directed the agents to march them straight out the heavy oak doors down the main corridor and directly through the sprawling glass-enclosed lobby of the building. It was a brilliantly cruel tactical maneuver. Chase had been so absolutely certain of his impending $30 million triumph that he had orchestrated his own public relations circus. He had hired a boutique media firm and invited journalists from 3 different regional agricultural publications and 2 local news syndicates to wait in the main lobby. They were positioned there to capture his triumphant exit, to photograph the moment he officially signed the massive land deal, sealing his status as the premier agricultural visionary of the state. He wanted front-page coverage of his ascension. Instead, the eager journalists waiting near the revolving glass doors were treated to the catastrophic collapse of his entire life. The elevator chimed, and the polished steel doors slid open. The ambient chatter in the lobby died instantly. Chase was pushed forward by 2 heavily armed federal agents, his hands shackled firmly behind his tailored suit. His head was bowed, his chin practically touching his chest, as he desperately tried to hide his face. Behind him, Chloe stumbled awkwardly in her high heels, her designer dress, rumpled, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale, panicked face as female agents guided her forward. The media crew froze for a fraction of a second, unable to process the jarring visual contradiction. They were expecting a victorious CEO holding a signed contract. They were staring at a federal perp walk. Then the journalistic instincts kicked in. The lobby erupted into a chaotic frenzy of flashing bulbs and shouted questions. Camera shutters clicked in a rapid, deafening staccato, blinding the couple in a relentless barrage of bright white light. The flashes illuminated every bead of sweat on Chase's forehead, every tear tracking through Chloe's expensive makeup. "Mr. Vance," a reporter yelled, thrusting a digital recorder forward. "Are you being arrested for environmental crimes? What happened to the $30 million sale? Did the EPA raid your sustainable farming operation?" Chase did not answer. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to physically shrink away from the harsh, glaring lights, but the agents kept him moving at a brisk, relentless pace. There was nowhere to hide. The public relations team he had paid thousands of dollars to curate his image stood paralyzed near the reception desk, watching their client being dragged away in absolute disgrace. They immediately began deleting their drafted press releases. The bright flashes continued, capturing the profound, unmistakable humiliation etched across his features. The fabricated illusion of the progressive green energy farmer was pulverized into microscopic dust before the eyes of the very public he sought to manipulate. He had built his entire identity on the perception of wealth and superiority, and now his local community was watching him get hauled away like a common criminal. The photographs gracing the front pages tomorrow would not celebrate a corporate merger. They would document his total, catastrophic ruin. The arrogant king of Heritage Sustainable Organics was dead, replaced by a shackled federal inmate being shoved through the revolving doors and out into the waiting, heavily armored transport vehicles. The public execution was flawless, but the financial dismantling of his co-conspirator was about to deliver a distinctly personalized devastation. The chaotic scene outside the corporate law firm escalated from a tense legal takedown into a full-blown public spectacle. The afternoon sun beat down on the pavement, casting harsh reflections across the fleet of dark federal transport vehicles idling near the curb. Chloe was being frog-marched toward the rear of a heavily armored federal cruiser. The designer heels she had proudly strutted in just an hour ago now proved to be a severe tactical disadvantage as she stumbled over the concrete sidewalk. Her knees buckled repeatedly, forcing the two female agents to haul her upright by her shackled arms. Tears carved deep, muddy rivers through her expensive foundation. She wailed with a shrill, piercing pitch that forced nearby pedestrians to stop and stare. The flashing bulbs of the press corps continued their relentless assault, capturing every humiliating angle of her downward spiral. She tried to twist her body away from the cameras, burying her face against her own shoulder to hide her ruined makeup, but her hands were immobilized behind her back. The heavy steel handcuffs dug into her wrists, scraping ruthlessly against the diamond tennis bracelet she still wore. That piece of jewelry purchased with stolen federal subsidies served as a glaring physical reminder of the exact crime she was currently being arrested for. "Stop taking pictures!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking as a particularly bright camera flash illuminated her tear-stained face. She whipped her head toward the cluster of local journalists standing behind the velvet security ropes. Her survival instincts forged in the shallow world of social climbing kicked into overdrive. She realized her carefully curated public image was disintegrating in real time. Desperation stripped away her remaining loyalty to the man she had married. "I did not do it," she screamed at the reporters, desperate to construct an alibi on the fly. "Chase made me sign those loan documents. I did not know where the money was coming from. He told me the agricultural grants were legitimate. He forced me to open those bank accounts. I am a victim here. He lied to me." She threw her husband under the speeding wheels of the federal justice system without a single second of hesitation. The united front of the arrogant power couple shattered the moment the prospect of actual prison time materialized. She hoped her frantic public confession would somehow buy her leniency or at least secure a sympathetic narrative in the evening news cycle. But the federal agents flanking her remained entirely unimpressed by her impromptu theatrical performance. They continued pushing her toward the open door of the police cruiser. As they forced her head down to clear the doorframe, Chloe managed to plant her feet against the asphalt, resisting the agents for one brief, fleeting moment. Her frantic, bloodshot eyes scanned the crowd of onlookers, bypassing the journalists and the bewildered office workers, until they locked directly onto me. I stood a few yards away near the entrance of the law firm, maintaining a quiet, steady observation of the entire arrest procedure. The fierce, venomous bully who had stood on my grandfather's patio and ordered me to collect my trash was gone. In her place was a terrified, cornered woman searching for any possible lifeline. She looked at my tailored suit and my serene expression. In her twisted, frantic mind, she calculated one final manipulative maneuver. She attempted to weaponize our shared gender, hoping to extract a sliver of unearned sympathy. "Evelyn, please," Chloe sobbed, her voice dropping into a pathetic begging whine. "Please tell them to let me go. We are family. We are sisters-in-law. Women have to protect each other. You know I would never intentionally participate in an environmental crime. You know how manipulative Chase can be. You have to help me explain this to the prosecutor. Please do not let them lock me inside that car." I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply looked at the woman who had happily mocked my career, belittled my wardrobe, and gleefully celebrated my unjust eviction from my childhood home. She wanted female solidarity from the exact same woman she had treated like dirt beneath her designer shoes. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her request was the final confirmation of her profound narcissistic delusion. Marcus, standing near the rear bumper of the cruiser, caught my eye. He gave a short, subtle nod, instructing the female agents to pause their movements for just a few seconds. He granted me the floor to deliver the final concluding strike to her fraudulent reality. I stepped off the curb, my low heels tapping a slow, rhythmic cadence against the pavement. I closed the distance between us, stopping just outside the open door of the police cruiser. Chloe looked up at me, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. A microscopic flicker of hope sparked in her eyes, mistakenly interpreting my approach as a gesture of impending mercy. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer. I did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her tears. I withdrew a single crisp piece of heavy bond paper. It bore the unmistakable, intimidating seal of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The top margin was printed with bold, stark red lettering that indicated a severe and immediate judicial action. I leaned forward, holding the document so she could read the harsh legal phrasing. I let the paper slip from my fingers. It fluttered down, landing softly on the harsh vinyl back seat of the police cruiser, right where she was about to be seated. "You should read that during your ride to the federal holding facility." "Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper that cut through the noise of the surrounding street. "That is not a standard traffic ticket. It is a criminal asset forfeiture order signed by a federal judge less than an hour ago." Chloe stared down at the paper, the tiny spark of hope in her eyes instantly extinguishing. "What does that mean?" she choked out, her voice barely a raspy breath. "It means the charade is over," I explained, articulating each word with clinical, surgical precision. "The government determined that your entire lifestyle was funded by stolen money. The millions of dollars your husband illegally extracted from the United States Department of Agriculture grants were routed into your personal accounts. You used those stolen subsidies to buy your imported luxury vehicles, your overseas vacation properties, and the very diamonds currently wrapped around your wrists." She slumped against the side of the vehicle, the blood draining entirely from her face. "Under federal law, the government is legally obligated to reclaim those stolen funds. I continued delivering the unvarnished truth without a shred of pity, and they do that by seizing every single item purchased with dirty money. As of this exact second, your bank accounts are locked. Your credit lines are erased. The federal marshals are currently at your gated estate, towing your sports cars and cataloging your jewelry boxes. You do not own a single thing anymore, Chloe. You are entering that federal prison as a completely destitute woman." She opened her mouth to argue, to scream, to protest the stripping of her identity, but her vocal cords simply failed her. For a woman whose entire self-worth was inextricably linked to her financial status, the loss of her material wealth was a punishment far more devastating than the loss of her actual freedom. She was reduced to nothing. "You gave me a piece of advice on the patio a few weeks ago," I said, stepping back from the vehicle to allow the federal agents to resume their duties. "You told me that a loser should know their place. You told me I needed to learn exactly where I belonged in the hierarchy of this family." I locked eyes with her, ensuring my final words would echo in her mind every single night she spent behind bars. "I hope you apply that lesson well in your federal cell for the next 10 years, Chloe." I stated, my tone ringing with profound, absolute finality. "Because you finally found your true place." I turned my back on her, walking away, before she could even formulate a response. The two female agents shoved her firmly into the back of the cruiser. She fell onto the vinyl seat, landing right next to the crisp white forfeiture notice. She finally found her voice, letting out a long, haunting scream of pure despair as the reality of her destitute future crushed her spirit. The heavy, reinforced door of the police cruiser slammed shut with a definitive, booming thud. The thick glass and steel instantly severed her frantic wailing, cutting her voice off from the outside world. The locking mechanism engaged, trapping her screams inside the dark, unforgiving machinery of federal law enforcement. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the convoy of dark government vehicles pull away from the curb. The flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding skyscrapers in a chaotic, shifting rhythm. The cars merged into the bustling city traffic, disappearing down the avenue, carrying the architects of my family, ruin away forever. The human threat had been successfully neutralized. The orchestrators of the fraud were caged, and their stolen wealth was reclaimed. Marcus stepped up beside me, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The tactical operation was a flawless success, but we both knew the mission was not entirely complete. The corporate battle was won, but the generational farm, the very soil that held the legacy of my ancestors, still bore the toxic scars of Chase's immense greed. "The criminals are gone," Marcus said quietly, adjusting his suit jacket. But the environmental damage on the northern ridge remains. The EPA inspectors are still scheduled to evaluate the soil toxicity on Monday morning. I looked at my brother-in-law, feeling the lingering adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a deep, resonant sense of duty. The blind trust I had constructed shielded the land from federal seizure, but it did not cure the poison lurking beneath the dirt. The ultimate redemption of the estate required more than just legal maneuvering. It required a relentless commitment to restoration. "Send the inspectors," I replied, turning my gaze away from the busy street and looking toward the horizon. "I am the sole director of Apex Vanguard Solutions now. We will absorb the cleanup costs. We will remediate the soil, and we will restore the land exactly the way it was meant to be. The real work starts tomorrow." 8 months passed since the federal raid dismantled the fraudulent empire that nearly erased our generational legacy. I stood in the center of the northern ridge, letting the crisp autumn wind wash over my face. The sprawling wheat field stretched out toward the horizon, a sea of gold swaying rhythmically under the vast Midwestern sky. The air tasted clean and sharp, entirely devoid of the chemical taint that had once choked this very soil. The remediation process had been grueling and incredibly expensive. Apex Vanguard Solutions deployed a specialized army of environmental engineers to execute the purification protocols. We excavated the contaminated dirt, installed advanced deep earth filtration barriers, and restored the groundwater aquifer to pristine conditions. The federal inspectors signed off on the final clearance certificates just last week, verifying that the land met every single stringent regulatory standard. The generational farm was breathing again, no longer a hostage to greed or toxic shortcuts. Saving the estate was merely the baseline objective. I refused to let the property stagnate as a relic of outdated agrarian traditions. My grandfather believed farming required a strong back and callous hands, dismissing my analytical skills as useless paper pushing. I utilized those exact analytical skills to transform his archaic operation into a premier high-tech agricultural research center. Drones now monitored the crop health utilizing infrared sensors to optimize watering schedules and detect nutrient deficiencies before they became visible to the naked eye. Automated harvesters operated with flawless precision, driven by the very algorithms I coded from my downtown corporate office. The estate partnered with top-tier universities to develop drought-resistant seed varieties, bridging the gap between historical farming and futuristic sustainability. We transitioned into a beacon of modern ecological innovation, generating millions of dollars in legitimate annual profit. The corporate structure was airtight, the ledgers were immaculate, and the revenue streams were entirely transparent. The woman they mocked for wearing business suits had cultivated a financial yield that the golden grandson could never have conceptualized in his wildest dreams. The distant crunch of tires on gravel pulled my attention away from the swaying crops. I turned to see a sleek, dark sedan pulling up the long driveway toward the main house. Marcus and my sister Clara stepped out of the vehicle, their faces breaking into bright, genuine smiles the moment they spotted me standing near the silos. Clara carried a large woven basket of fresh pastries from a local bakery, while Marcus held a stack of environmental compliance briefings he wanted to review over dinner. I walked to meet them, the heavy burden of familial duty replaced by the uplifting warmth of true kinship. The old farmhouse, which used to echo with suffocating tension and performative Sunday dinners, now resonated with authentic, joyous laughter. We gathered in the updated kitchen, pouring crisp white wine and discussing future expansion projects for the research facility. There were no hidden agendas, no manipulative whispers in the hallways, and no toxic patriarchs demanding blind obedience. We had purged the poison from the bloodline and erected a new foundation built strictly on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and shared integrity. While we celebrated the harvest, the architects of the sabotage were currently experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal penal system. The prosecution phase was swift and merciless. Facing a towering mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, forensic audits, and environmental impact reports, the defense attorneys had virtually zero leverage to negotiate. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse and watched the final sentencing. Chase did not receive a lenient plea deal. The judge handed him a 20-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, money laundering, and egregious environmental sabotage. The arrogant executive who used to sip premium bourbon and wear custom Italian linen is now confined to a small concrete cell. He wears a standardized prison uniform, earning pennies an hour working in the correctional laundry facility. He has no assets, no influence, and zero prospect of early parole. Chloe met a similarly devastating fate. She is serving a 10-year sentence in a separate federal correctional institution. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her flawless diamond jewelry were all seized and auctioned off by the government to cover the remaining restitution for the stolen subsidies. They gambled their freedom for a shortcut to unearned wealth and lost every single chip on the table. The illusion of their superiority shattered against the cold, hard wall of federal justice, leaving them with nothing but the consequences of their own boundless greed. The downfall of my brother stands as a definitive testament to the fatal flaw of narcissistic predators. They perpetually underestimate the quiet individuals in the room. They view stoicism as submission and interpret a lack of immediate retaliation as a green light to escalate their abuse. Chase thought my silence in the oak-paneled study all those months ago was a white flag of surrender. He believed that because I did not shout or throw a theatrical tantrum, I had simply accepted my role as the defeated sibling. He failed to comprehend that a calculated mind does not waste valuable energy on useless verbal arguments. Every time he mocked my career, every time he paraded his stolen wealth, and every time he threatened to ruin my professional reputation, I was silently compiling the ledger of his sins. I allowed him to construct his own gallows, handing him the rope, while he foolishly believed he was building an untouchable throne. This journey serves as a vital blueprint for anyone trapped in the suffocating grip of a toxic family dynamic. Society frequently pressures us to forgive blood relatives, demanding that we overlook severe transgressions simply because we share a surname or a genetic history. That expectation is a dangerous trap designed to keep victims compliant and vulnerable. True power is recognizing that biological ties do not excuse predatory behavior. When dealing with individuals who exploit your patience and weaponize your trust, you must detach your emotions and operate with surgical precision. A woman maintaining her silence is never a symptom of weakness. It is the crucial, undisturbed time she requires to build a flawless, unassailable indictment. Do not ever mistake tolerance for stupidity. Never allow entitlement to blind you to the quiet observers who possess the capability to audit your entire existence and dismantle your life piece by piece. The strongest person in the room is rarely the one screaming the loudest or boasting about their status. The true victor is the one who maintains a cold, analytical head, playing the long, strategic game until the final steel handcuffs click shut. Have you ever had to utilize the law to clean out the toxic trash within your own family tree? Share your stories of strategic survival and ultimate justice in the comments below.